Hello. This lecture will give an overview of Neo Confucian thought. To begin, it's important to note that the term Neo Confucianism is not one that's directly translated from Chinese. Rather, in Chinese, the Neo Confucian movement is described by a phrase that means something like the learning of the way. So that tells us something about what Neo Confucianism is about. It's about how we are to learn about the right way to live. Now, this movement existed in roughly the same time period as the Middle Ages. But in China, this was a great flourishing of different kinds of thought. And really, there are two different branches of Neo Confucianism. On the one hand, there's the school of pattern. That's the one that came first. And sometimes this is called the Chang-Zhu school. And that's because the school of pattern's primary proponents are these brothers named Shang and a philosopher that we'll focus on, Zhu Xi. This first school focuses on that notion of pattern, which we'll talk about in a bit. But the basic idea is that this school focuses on intellectual knowledge, metaphysical knowledge, which is what that pattern is about. And having that intellectual knowledge will provide you with the foundation for right action, a foundation for acting in accordance with the way. And we acquire that intellectual knowledge by reading books and metaphysical investigation. In particular, we read books of the sages, and we learn what they have to say, and then we'll use that to further our development, to further our self-cultivation. What's important, though, is that you begin with study of books and theories. Now, the school of mind was also Neo-Confucian, but offered a very different approach in reaction to that earlier school of pattern. And sometimes this approach is called the Lu Wang school, and that's also named after its proponents, and we're going to focus primarily on the thought of Wang Yangming. Now, whereas the previous school thought that you needed to begin with study and reading books and so on, this school says that you have all the knowledge that you need within you. And really the task for this school is to bring that knowledge outside of oneself. In addition to downplaying the importance of intellectual knowledge, this school also emphasizes action, that you can't genuinely have knowledge of something without engaging in action of a particular sort. And we'll talk about that idea in a later lecture. Now, before moving on to get an overview of some key Neo-Confucian texts and ideas, it's important to note why we're calling this Neo-Confucian. And that's because the thinkers here are Confucians, but they're reacting to and responding to ideas from Buddhism and Taoism. And so several of the thinkers here had actually studied Buddhism and Taoism, but then came to reject those different views. But nevertheless, they sometimes, despite themselves, accept certain views or ideas from Buddhism and Taoism that were not in the original Confucian text. And that brings us to one of the most important Neo-Confucian philosophers, Zhu Xi. He was someone that had been exposed to Buddhism and Taoism, but came to reject them and instead embraced Confucianism. And he's really important for systematizing Neo-Confucian thought. And he does this in a variety of ways. One of the ways he does this is by making critical editions of various Confucian texts. So these include texts like the Anoex, but also other classic texts like the Book of Rites. And basically, he's looking at various different manuscripts that existed and trying to get the correct version of the text, because when you have manuscripts, there are changes that develop over time. Now, part of that same process involved giving commentaries onto the text. So Zhu Xi wrote commentaries, for example, to the Anoex, to the Mengzi, and to other texts, and this would be to give interpretations to those texts. So basically what would happen is the original text would be presented, like a paragraph of it, and then he would give a commentary on it saying how to interpret what the original text says, how to apply it, how to understand certain ideas. But there were other texts besides these sort of classic texts. So an anthology called The Reflections on Things at Hand was one that he, along with someone else, edited of various Neo-Confucian philosophers, various things that they said. And then he also had his own texts, his own dialogues with others that his students would record. Now, Juxi's importance almost cannot be overemphasized. He was someone that set down the primary text to study in the Confucian tradition, and this would be accepted for hundreds of years and accepted in the education system for taking civil service exams. So he really set out something that became standardized practice. But it's important to note that he initially was rejected by various rulers. His thought was seen as dangerous, but it became standard later. Let us now turn to the general metaphysical view that Juxi accepts, which is roughly accepted by the brothers Cheng, and maybe to some extent by the later philosophers such as Wang Yangming. So recall that metaphysics is a theory or study of what ultimately exists. And for the Neo-Confucian philosophers, what ultimately exists are two different kinds of things. So it is a dualist view. So there are other dualist views in Western philosophy, for example, a view that holds that all that exists is either mind or body, and mind and body are distinct, but that's not the same dualism that we have here. What we have here is a dualism between two different kinds of things. One is called qi, which gets translated in various ways, sometimes not translated because it's such a special term. And one useful translation, though, is something like psychophysical stuff. So that's one item of the dualism, psychophysical stuff. And then the other item is called li, which can be translated as something like pattern, and sometimes gets translated as principle. So those are the two kinds of things. Now, the psychophysical stuff, notice, if we translate it that way, we're saying it has psychic characteristics as well as physical characteristics. So it's matter, what we would call matter, but it's not matter devoid of living psychic properties. So it exists in space and time, but it's living, it moves on its own, it comes in a variety of different forms, and is responsible for some psychological phenomena. So various emotions can be attributed to the psychophysical stuff. Now, pattern, on the other hand, there's just one pattern. So whereas the psychophysical stuff, it's heterogeneous, there's a bunch of different kinds, there's only one pattern, and it sort of makes up the entire universe. And so we might understand this as sort of the structure of the universe, the various laws that bind it together, and every particular thing manifests that structure. Now, since everything manifests that structure, we would want to know, well, what makes things different from each other? Because insofar as everything has the same pattern, insofar as I have the same pattern as my cat, as my computer, well, we're not really different. So it's really with that psychophysical stuff that each thing is individuated and made the kind of thing it is distinct from other things. And so indeed, we'll see that these Neo-Confucian philosophers say that different people have different qi, have different psychophysical stuff, some that's brighter, some that's dimmer, some that is more conducive to the path of self-cultivation, some that makes it more difficult. But in any case, pattern is really going to be what gives us the way, the proper way to live. And so the task of self-cultivation is to refine your psychophysical stuff. So refine your body and mind so that it more fully embraces or exemplifies pattern. So that's an overview of the general metaphysical view, and keep this in mind as we go along and look at the account of self-cultivation that's given by different Neo-Confucian philosophers. But to conclude, I want to note that there's 4 main books that are studied in a Neo-Confucian philosophy. So these are considered the primary starting point for the path of self-cultivation. And they come in a particular order. First, there's the Great Learning, which is in fact a chapter of a classic text called the Book of Rites. Then there's the Anoex, then there's the Mengzi, and then there's another chapter of the Book of Rites, the Doctrine of the Mean. Now, we'll be focusing in the coming lectures on the first of these texts, the Great Learning. And it's traditionally thought to have been written by one of Confucius's disciples, although later scholars have found evidence that that's probably not the case. Nevertheless, it's important for understanding Neo-Confucian philosophers to recognize that they attribute this source of the text. That's because it comes from a tradition stemming from Confucius himself. So the Great Learning is worth studying because it has a lineage within the Confucian tradition being written by one of Confucius's disciples. And what the Great Learning does is set out the various steps to engage in the process of self-cultivation, to become an exemplary, virtuous person. And then reading those other texts and studying those other texts, like the Anoex, like the Mengzi, and so on, those will help you carry out that process of self-cultivation given in outline form in the Great Learning. In the coming lectures, I'll present what the Great Learning says about self-cultivation.